The impossible discovery. The Springfield Public Archives were silent on a Tuesday morning in late October 1904. The kind of silence that only exists in places devoted to preserving the past, a reverent, dusty quiet broken only by the soft whisper of turning pages and the occasional creak of ancient floorboards. Eleanor Vance sat at a mahogany desk surrounded by leather-bound ledgers, her fingers stained with the residue of old paper and fading ink. She was 43 years old, with sharp eyes that noticed everything and a mind trained to find patterns where others saw only chaos. She had worked in the archives for 17 years, long enough to understand that history was rarely written the way people thought. It was written in the margins, in the inconsistencies in the moments when someone forgot to maintain the official fiction. The ledger before her had belonged to Thomas Blackwood, a wealthy merchant who had died in 1902, leaving behind 3 generations of meticulously kept business records. Thomas Blackwood had been the kind of man who documented everything, every shipment, every transaction, every penny earned or spent. His ledgers were beautiful in their precision, written in a hand so controlled it seemed inhuman. Perfect columns, perfect entries, perfect lies. Eleanor had been hired by Blackwood's estate to organize his papers for the library's historical collection. It was tedious work mostly, sorting through decades of commercial correspondence, noting dates and transactions, ensuring everything was properly cataloged and preserved. She had found nothing unusual in the first dozen ledgers. Blackwood had been a shipping merchant, successful and respected, exactly as his reputation suggested. But then she found the entry that made her pause. It was in the ledger for 1872, dated May 15th, written in Blackwood's distinctive hand. Payment to Dr. Marcus Whitmore, services rendered for confinement and care, $400. Eleanor's pencil stopped moving. She read the entry 3 times, her brow furrowing slightly. The amount was substantial, equivalent to nearly 2 months' wages for a skilled worker. The terminology was vague. Confinement and care. What kind of medical service required such secrecy? Blackwood had never been a man to hide his business dealings. Every other entry in his ledgers was precise and explicable. She pulled down additional ledgers from 1872 and began cross-referencing. What she found made her sit back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. There were other entries, several of them scattered throughout the year. June 3rd, payment to Dr. Whitmore, continued services, $300. July 10th, supplies for household, discretionary account, $150. August 1st, additional funds, medical provisions, $200. The pattern was clear. Someone was being paid regular sums, always from what Blackwood labeled personal discretionary accounts. Never explained in detail, never cross-referenced to any other document or manifest. It was as if Blackwood wanted these payments to be recorded. There they were in plain sight in his own hand, but somehow hidden, obscured by their very openness. Eleanor had learned over her years in the archives that the most effective way to hide something was to place it in plain sight, embedded within thousands of mundane details. Like a single dark stone in a riverbed, you only noticed it when you were specifically looking. She began her investigation carefully, methodically, the way a detective might search a crime scene. She requested census records for the years surrounding 1872. She requested church baptismal records. She searched property deeds associated with the Blackwood family. She created a timeline on a slip of paper, tracking every financial anomaly she could find. By the end of the week, Eleanor had a theory so troubling that she shared it with no one, not even her supervisor. Instead, she began to research the Blackwood family in earnest. Springfield, 1872. The World Before. Springfield in 1872 was a prosperous town on the rise. The railway had come through 5 years earlier, transforming it from an agricultural community into a commercial hub. Fortunes were being made, and one of the men making them was Thomas Blackwood. Thomas was a man in his late 40s then, distinguished in appearance, with iron-gray hair and eyes that seemed to calculate everything they observed. He had built his shipping business from nothing, starting as a dock worker and gradually accumulating enough capital to negotiate contracts with manufacturers. By 1872, he employed 50 people and was considering expansion into 3 neighboring counties. He had married a woman named Sarah in 1850, a union that appeared to be primarily a business arrangement between 2 established families. Sarah was the daughter of a prominent banker, and her marriage to Thomas had solidified his position in Springfield's elite circles. They had 3 children together: William, born in 1851, Margaret, born in 1855, and Richard, born in 1860. All 3 were healthy, well-educated, and presented to society as the legitimate fruits of a legitimate marriage. But in the winter of 1871, Sarah Blackwood became pregnant again. The pregnancy was different from the others. From its earliest weeks, Sarah suffered from unusual symptoms: persistent fever, violent nausea that lingered long past the first trimester, episodes of delirium in which she spoke in strange, disconnected fragments. The family physician, Dr. Marcus Whitmore, prescribed tonics and rest, assuring Thomas that such difficulties were sometimes the burden of the female constitution. As spring arrived, Sarah's condition worsened. She spent long days confined to her bedroom, the curtains drawn against the bright April sun. Her body seemed to be fighting something internally, as if pregnancy had awakened some dark force within her. The enslaved women who attended to her, for Sarah, though not in a southern state, lived in a household with domestic servants bound by poverty and circumstance, whispered among themselves. They spoke of curses, of bad humors, of the punishment of God. Thomas Blackwood, a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life through sheer force of will and meticulous planning, found himself facing something he could not control. His wife's suffering was an imperfection in his carefully constructed world. It threatened the image of prosperity and wellness that he had so carefully cultivated. When the birth finally came in May, after a labor that lasted nearly 3 days, it seemed to confirm Thomas's worst fears. The screams from the birthing room echoed faintly through the mansion's corridors, sounds of such anguish that the neighbors, despite the distance between houses, felt compelled to inquire if assistance was needed. Thomas assured them everything was well. He was lying. The birth and the choice. What emerged from that bedroom was not the healthy son Thomas had expected. The child was a boy, but profoundly wrong. His body was twisted in ways that seemed impossible. His spine curved in an S shape, his limbs splayed at angles that suggested they had been shattered before birth. His face, though recognizably human, was marked by a severe cleft palate and lip, and his eyes were misaligned in their sockets. He could not cry with the robust vigor of a healthy newborn. Instead, he produced only a weak, reedy sound, barely audible from beyond the bedroom door. Dr. Whitmore, his face draining of color as he beheld the child, spoke to Thomas with professional gravity. The child was deformed, he explained, using the terminology of the era. Severely deformed. He would never walk. He would never speak normally. He would require constant, intensive care for whatever life remained to him. The physician's implicit message was clear. This child was a tragedy, a burden, something to be ashamed of. Thomas Blackwood stood in the candle-lit bedroom, listening to the faint, distressing sounds of his newborn son, and made a decision that would echo through the next 30 years, a decision born of fear, of pride, and of a chilling pragmatism about what his family could endure. This child, he decided, would not exist. In the rigid social hierarchy of the 1870s, a visibly disabled child born into a prominent family was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a public catastrophe, a stain on family honor that could affect the marriage prospects of his siblings, damage his father's business reputation, and invite the kind of relentless social scrutiny that could unravel years of careful social positioning. Thomas Blackwood understood something that few people fully grasp, that respectability is not an inherent quality, but a performance. It is a story you tell about yourself, reinforced through every interaction, every choice, every public appearance. One crack in that facade, one hint of scandal or imperfection could unravel the entire narrative. The child was given a name by Sarah in her delirium, James, a simple, unremarkable name. But James would never be recorded in the family Bible where the births of his siblings were inscribed. He would never be baptized in the family church. He would never be acknowledged by his father in any official capacity. Instead, Thomas embarked on an extraordinary deception. The federal census was due to be taken in a few months. The census enumerator for the county was a man named Samuel Crane, a distant business associate of Thomas Blackwood's, known more for his accommodating nature than for any meticulous attention to detail. Crane was the kind of man who understood the unspoken rules of deference to those of higher social standing. When Samuel Crane arrived at Blackwood's mansion in July 1872, his ledger and pencil in hand, he was greeted by Thomas with his customary cordiality. They sat on the veranda, sipping lemonade, while Crane dutifully recorded the household's details. Thomas listed his wife Sarah and their 3 older children, William, Margaret, and Richard, their ages given precisely. Then, with a casualness that belied the monumental lie he was about to utter, Thomas added another name to the census: James Blackwood, age 7. Samuel Crane, perhaps distracted by the heat or by the pleasant conversation, or perhaps simply by his ingrained respect for Thomas Blackwood, made no comment. He recorded the information as given, his pencil scratching across the page. The phantom James Blackwood, the child who existed only on paper, was born in the official record. The audacity of the deception was breathtaking, its execution chillingly simple. By listing a James who was supposedly 7 years old in 1872, Thomas had created a convenient fiction. A child who had been born years before this real James, who could age naturally in the records, who would never cause the questions that a missing child might provoke. For 5 years, the phantom James aged in the official census records, a ghost in the machine of bureaucracy, while the real James, the twisted, voiceless child locked away in a room at the back of the mansion, remained completely hidden. The hidden years. The room where James spent his existence was on the 3rd floor of Blackwood's mansion, in a wing that was rarely visited. It had once served as a storage room, perhaps for linens or seasonal decorations, but Thomas Blackwood had repurposed it with chilling efficiency. He had sealed the single window from the outside, boarding it up with thick planks of pine nailed securely in place. He had installed a heavy lock on the door, a good lock, expensive, the kind meant to keep something in or keep someone out. He furnished the room with the bare minimum: a narrow wooden cot with a thin mattress, a chamber pot in the corner, a small rough table that held a single oil lamp. The lamp was perpetually burning,
a candle or oil providing the only light in that enclosed space. It created a twilight existence, neither truly day nor truly night. Just an endless gray dimness, broken only when someone entered to feed the child. That someone was primarily a woman named Martha, who worked as a domestic in the Blackwood household. Martha was bound to this household by poverty and circumstance, her labor exploited in the way that was common for working women of that era. She fed James each day, thin gruel, weak broth, water. She cleaned the chamber pot. She changed what linens existed. She spoke to him sometimes in soft tones, though she was forbidden from lingering, from showing affection, from acknowledging him as anything but a task to be completed. Sarah Blackwood, James's mother, was devastated by her own complicity in his imprisonment. Her already fragile nerves, strained by the difficult pregnancy and the trauma of his birth, shattered completely under the weight of the secret. She took increasing quantities of laudanum, the common medication for women's nervous complaints, using it to numb both her physical pain and her moral anguish. She rarely left her bedroom. When she did venture out, her eyes had a haunted quality, as if she had glimpsed something unspeakable.
The other children, William, Margaret, and Richard, were vaguely aware that something was not right. They occasionally heard sounds from the back wing, faint noises that seemed almost human, but not quite. They were told never to venture back there, that it was a private area not meant for them. They learned not to ask questions. In Victorian households, children learned quickly to ignore what they were not supposed to notice. Thomas Blackwood, meanwhile, seemed entirely unmoved by what his son endured. He went about his business. His shipping firm prospered. He was seen at his club, at dinner parties, at the social events that defined Springfield's elite. He was, to all outward appearances, exactly what he claimed to be, a man of substance and respectability. But once a month, on the first day of every month without fail, Thomas would visit the room in the back wing. He would unlock the door, step inside for 15 to 30 minutes, and then lock it again. What transpired during these visits no one ever knew. But Eleanor, reading between the lines of the ledgers and the sparse records available, began to suspect that Thomas was not checking on his son out of any paternal instinct. He was conducting inspections, the way a man might inspect a broken piece of machinery he had decided to keep rather than discard. The hidden child grew in that locked room, from infant to toddler to child to pre-adolescent. 11 years. 11 years of darkness, of confinement, of minimal human contact, of a life lived in almost complete isolation. No sunlight except what thin rays filtered through the cracks in the boarded window. No normal childhood, no education, no play, no interaction with the world beyond those walls. As James grew, his deformities became more pronounced. His movements became more contorted. He never learned to speak, communicating instead through guttural sounds and the desperate, uncontrolled movements of his twisted limbs. He was a prisoner in his own body, confined in a room that became his entire universe. But somewhere in the darkness, James found a way to leave his mark. With what? A loose nail? A shard of pottery? Perhaps even his own fingernails? He began to scratch at the walls. Hundreds of scratches, thousands of them, thin, irregular marks that accumulated over the years, creating a visual testimony to the passage of time. They were not organized, not a calendar in any formal sense, but rather a chaotic tapestry of lines, each one a silent assertion of existence. He also made drawings, crude, desperate drawings etched into the plaster,
perhaps with a piece of charcoal or a stone. They depicted figures unmistakably human but distorted, with limbs bent at impossible angles, with features warped and wrong. They were self-portraits, a child trying to make sense of his own fractured form, trying to understand what he was in a world that had denied him existence.
The investigation and discovery. Eleanor Vance's investigation began not with grand deductions, but with persistent, methodical work. She spent weeks cross-referencing documents, creating timelines, following threads that seemed to lead nowhere. But she had learned over her years in the archives that history rewarded patience. She discovered that in the 1880 census, James Blackwood was no longer listed. The phantom child had vanished from the records as mysteriously as he had appeared. Thomas Blackwood had simply removed him from the 1880 census, leaving no explanation. The real James Blackwood, whoever he was, had become completely invisible. Not even a phantom in the documents, but a complete absence, a void where a person should have been. Eleanor approached Thomas Blackwood's widow, Margaret, now a woman in her 70s, living in a much-reduced version of the family's former mansion. Eleanor explained her role as archivist and her interest in clarifying some inconsistencies in the historical records. She was careful, professional, and indirect. Margaret Blackwood's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her face went pale, her hands trembled. She asked Eleanor to leave her home and never return. But in that moment, Eleanor knew. Whatever was hidden was real. She began interviewing people who had worked for the Blackwood family in that era, elderly people now, their memories fragmented but often vivid. She spoke with Dr. Marcus Whitmore's son, a physician himself, who mentioned that his father had often seemed troubled by something in the later years of his life, something he would never discuss. She located Martha, the woman who had cared for the hidden child, now an old woman living in poverty on the outskirts of town. Eleanor approached her with deference, speaking not of census records, but of the old days, of memories and family. Gradually, carefully, Martha began to speak. "There was a child," Martha said, her voice barely audible, "born to Mrs. Blackwood in 1872, a child who was not right. Master Blackwood, he couldn't bear it, said it was shameful, said he wouldn't have such a thing in his house, not for the world to see. I cared for the child. For years I cared for him, but no one was supposed to know. No one was supposed to speak of him." "What happened to the child?" Eleanor asked gently. Martha looked away, her aged eyes filling with tears she no longer had the strength to contain. "He died," she whispered. "Around 1883, I think. The master said it was a mercy, that the boy had suffered enough. I never saw a grave. I never saw anything after they took him away." Eleanor felt something in her chest constrict, a physical response to the weight of what she was uncovering. This wasn't just a mysterious ledger entry or a census anomaly anymore. This was a human being, a child who had existed, who had suffered, who had been systematically denied existence by the very people who were supposed to protect him. She pressed for more details, and slowly, painfully, a picture emerged. James had been born with severe physical disabilities, the exact nature of which no one would explicitly state, but which were clearly profound. He had been hidden away, fed and maintained, but never acknowledged, never truly cared for. He had spent his childhood in a locked room, completely isolated from the world. And then, sometime in the early 1880s, he had died. Thomas Blackwood had died in 1895, still respected, still prosperous, his secrets intact. But Eleanor had found them, scattered through the ledgers and the memories of aging servants. The real James Blackwood had been erased from history,
but the ledgers had preserved a ghost of his existence.
The sealed room revealed. Eleanor decided she needed to see the house. She needed to understand the physical space where this child had been hidden. She approached William Blackwood, Thomas's eldest son, now in his late 50s, a man who had spent his entire life in the shadow of his father's obsession with respectability. She was honest with William about her discovery. She laid out the facts clearly, the unusual payments, the census anomalies, the inconsistencies in the official record. She explained that as an archivist, she had a professional and moral obligation to understand the truth. William's reaction was conflicted. She could see the struggle in his face, the weight of long-carried knowledge pressing against the force of family loyalty. He was torn between his desire to keep his father's secrets and his apparent relief that someone finally knew, finally acknowledged what had happened. After a long silence, William agreed to let Eleanor examine the house. He led her to the back wing, to the 3rd floor, to a room that had been sealed shut for over 2 decades. The door was unremarkable, wooden, painted pale gray with a heavy iron lock. The lock was old but still functional. When William reluctantly provided a key, Eleanor's hands shook as she turned it. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet. The single window was indeed boarded over from the inside, thick planks of pine nailed securely, letting in only thin slits of pale light. The air was stale, heavy, thick with the scent of age and abandonment. There was a narrow cot with a thin, stained mattress, a chamber pot overturned in a corner, a rough wooden table, its surface scarred and marked by years of use, and covering nearly every inch of the walls, from floor to ceiling, marks, scratches, thousands of them, maybe more. Eleanor stepped closer, holding her lamp high. The scratches were not random, they formed patterns. Some were organized in rough rows, as if someone had been attempting to track time. Others were chaotic and frenzied, lines overlapping lines, creating a visual representation of desperation and madness. And among the scratches, there were drawings, crude, heartbreaking drawings of human figures, distorted and wrong, limbs bent at impossible angles. A child's attempt to understand his own body, to make sense of his own existence in a world that had denied him the right to exist. Eleanor stood in that room for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, understanding the full weight of what she was seeing. Every mark on that wall was a moment of consciousness, a moment in which James Blackwood had asserted his existence against the absolute denial of it by everyone around him. She documented everything carefully. She took notes, she sketched the wall markings, she photographed the room, using the new technology of photography to preserve what she was seeing. And then she sat down and wept. The truth emerged. Eleanor prepared a report. She was careful, methodical, and presented the facts without sensationalism. She documented her sources, the ledgers, the census records, the interviews with servants and physicians, the physical evidence of the sealed room. She presented a narrative that, while tragic, was grounded in evidence and careful investigation. The response was mixed. Some praised her for bringing a hidden truth to light. Others criticized her for airing family secrets, for disturbing the peace of the deceased, for causing pain to the living Blackwoods. The Blackwood family itself made no public response, though William Blackwood reportedly said in private that Vance had no right to dig up the past. But Eleanor had accomplished something important. She had brought James Blackwood back into existence. The child who had been erased from the records, who had been hidden away and forgotten, was now documented. The phantom child had been explained, and in being explained, had been given a kind of dignity that he had never possessed in life. The story of James Blackwood spread through Springfield's educated circles, passed along in hushed conversations and fragmented retellings. It became a kind of local legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrets, about the price of respectability, about what happens when a family values appearance over compassion. Some versions of the story grew embellished over time. Some people claimed that James hadn't actually been as severely disabled as the records suggested, that Thomas Blackwood had hidden him out of pure vanity. Others whispered that he had escaped from the room and run away, living somewhere in anonymity. Still others suggested that Thomas Blackwood had actively killed the child, smothering him to end his suffering. None of these versions were supported by evidence, but they showed how people needed to process what had happened, how they sought to make meaning from tragedy, how a story of absolute cruelty born of shame was too heavy to bear without some narrative transformation. The truth, Eleanor understood, was more complex and more terrible than the embellished versions. The truth was that a child had been born into a family that could not accept his imperfection. The truth was that he had been hidden away, not out of mercy, but out of shame. The truth was that he had lived, actually lived, in a locked room for over a decade, his existence denied, his humanity ignored, his desperate attempts at self-expression scratched into a wall that no one was supposed to see. The truth was that a man had committed a crime for which there was no law, had harmed a child in a way that the legal system could not address, because the harm was not physical but existential. The denial of the child's right to exist, to be acknowledged, to matter. The legacy and final questions. The Blackwood Mansion still stands in Springfield, though it has been divided into apartments and its grandeur has faded. The back room still exists, though the walls have been repainted, the scratches covered over. But for those who know the history, the room carries a different weight. It is a monument to a crime that went unpunished, to a secret that took over 30 years to uncover, to a human being who was systematically denied existence. Eleanor Vance never married. She never had children of her own. Instead, she devoted herself to her work in the archives, to the careful preservation of history, to the documentation of stories that might otherwise be lost. She died in 1937, having spent the remainder of her life bringing forgotten stories into the light. The story of James Blackwood raises profound questions, questions that we still grapple with today. Why do families hide members they deem unacceptable? How do we reconcile the desire to protect family reputation with the moral imperative to acknowledge the humanity of all people? What is the cost of silence? What is gained by bringing hidden truths to light? The story also challenges us to think about what we hide, what we deny, what we are willing to erase in order to maintain the appearance of normalcy. James Blackwood is not unique in history. Throughout time, families have hidden away members deemed undesirable, inconvenient, or shameful. Children with disabilities have been locked away, denied education, denied dignity, denied existence. It happened in the 1870s. It happened throughout the 20th century. In some places, it still happens today.
Eleanor Hartwell's investigation, her simple act of noticing that something didn't fit, her persistent, methodical pursuit of truth in a community that preferred its secrets undisturbed, was an act of profound justice. It took a mystery that was meant to be forgotten and brought it into the light. It gave a name and a story to a child who was meant to be erased. It asked the world to see James Blackwood, really see him, not as a problem to be hidden, but as a human being who deserved to matter.
The phantom child of Willow Manor became, through Eleanor's investigation, a real person with a documented history. And that documentation, that acknowledgement, is perhaps the only form of justice that could ever reach him. In 1904, a librarian noticed something odd in a ledger. In that moment of curiosity, in that decision to ask questions, she changed history. She transformed an absence into a presence. She transformed silence into testimony. She brought a child who was meant to be forgotten back into being, not in flesh, but in memory, not in life, but in history. That is the power of truth. That is why we search for it, even when it is hidden in locked rooms and written in the margins of old ledgers. Because every person deserves to be counted. Every person deserves to matter. And that is a truth that no amount of shame or silence can ultimately suppress.